Okay, I'd like to begin this week by actually going through and talking about the chapter in Fink because it's actually a good way of transitioning from the annotated bibliography that you're currently working on or that you are submitting this week and moving more towards, how do you start putting together that literature review. And this is actually, I think, is probably one of the better chapters that Fink has. I know there's only 5 in the book, but in my opinion, this is probably, I think, the most useful and practical chapter that she has throughout the book. So let's take a look at going through some of the things that Fink discusses. So first, what we have is, you've got lots of articles at this point. In fact, you probably have more articles than what you will end up using. If you think about it, as part of the literature search strategies, you were asked to identify 25 items that you had, pieces of literature that you had identified from the various Sacred Heart University databases that you were searching through. You were suggested it was suggested to you that you should continue searching, and that the 25 most relevant ones that you included in that search strategy wouldn't be necessarily all of the ones that you had. In fact, I believe throughout class I've told you that you're likely to review probably 3 times that many once you're completely done with this process, and about half of those, so you're going to be reviewing 70 to 80 or maybe more of these, and about half of those will likely end up in your literature review. So the question is, how do you figure out which ones of those? From your annotated bibliography, you've hopefully narrowed the initial list that you have down to the 15 to 20 that you're writing annotations for, or 15 to 20 or more that you're writing annotations for, and in some cases those are ones that you just picked because you had already read through them carefully. What I'm hoping has happened is that you've picked them because you think that they will be most useful to you as you're moving forward. So when you're looking at how you can decide which articles that you want to include, this idea of eligibility. There are a number of things to look at. We've talked the last couple of weeks, in the chapters 2 and 3 of Fink, talked about methodological screening and how you can look at this literature that you're finding and determine whether or not it's providing you with good research, or whether or not it's providing you with people's opinions or people's commentaries, whether those commentaries are based upon good research or whether it's just based upon people's opinions. So you've had some tools that have come to you. The thing that I want to sort of underscore is, as you start writing, to keep in mind that the literature review isn't a review of all of the literature. It's a review of all of the relevant literature. So there are things that you have found at this stage, and will continue to find, that while they are about your topic, they may not necessarily be relevant to your particular literature review. So Fink talks about a couple of things here that you can use as a way of trying to look at which ones you should include compared to which ones that you shouldn't include. Some of the things that she talks about are, trying to limit the numbers that you've got, so creating this idea of inclusion and exclusion criteria. As an example that she has in here, one of the things that she talks about that we haven't done is, she assumes that you are starting this with a specific research question, which, as I've mentioned to you in the past, I think is putting the cart before the horse. As Boot and Beale have advised us in one of the previous articles that we were looking at, the idea of what your research question should be grounded in the literature, not necessarily that you go out searching the literature based upon a particular research question. So you're seeing sort of 2 different perspectives there, and in all honesty, the perspective that both I subscribe to, plus the one I would argue is the dominant one in the field, is the one that Boot and Beale have put forward. So the other thing that you want to look at is, how do you start to develop inclusion and exclusion criteria? Keeping in mind that Fink comes from a highly quantitative, very objectivist kind of perspective. One of the things that she suggests as part of her example inclusion criteria is randomized controlled trials. Now, we've talked about some of the difficulties of randomized controlled trials and the whole idea of experimental and quasi-experimental methodologies, and some of the faults that you have with those particular methodologies, or some of the limitations, if you will, particularly within an educational context. What I would modify that particular line with is, one of the things you might look to do is focus more upon empirical research. And by empirical, I don't mean quantitative or numerical. By empirical, I mean research that has a high degree of reliability and validity. So that could include qualitative methods, it could include quantitative methods, it could include a combination of the two. The idea being that essentially you are using good research to inform your literature review and to guide your literature review. One of the other suggestions that Fink makes is by classifying the studies using the methodology. So using the methodological screening that she talks about in chapters 2 and 3 as a way to help guide your process. One of the things we've talked about in class, particularly as you were getting ready to prepare your annotated bibliographies, was using this idea of keywords or topics or themes as a way of trying to essentially classify or group your particular studies. So there's a number of different ways in which you can kind of go about doing this. As another example, you can assign sort of a scoring system that you would use to indicate your level of confidence in the nature of the quality of the research that you're reading. Although, as Fink notes, one of the big disadvantages of that is it's very subjective in nature from your perspective, because let's face it, it's not necessarily something that it's a process that in and of itself doesn't have a high degree of validity and reliability. Why did you pick a 7 on this one instead of a 6? And what is the difference between the things that you've assigned a 7 to or a 6 to in terms of, scoring the quality of the research that you have? So that's sort of one method. The other one that Fink talks a little bit about in her chapter is this idea of using some kind of questionnaire. And in some of the matrices that were suggested or that were provided as part of the annotated bibliography, this idea of coming up with a questionnaire, and while they don't sort of put the things in question format, if you could imagine each of the columns that were recommended to you, or each of the rows that you've got within some of the matrices that were provided as guidance for the annotated bibliography, if you could envision those in the way of questions, that could be a way of essentially trying to screen through these particular articles to try to determine which ones are of quality and how do you start to group some of these together. One of the things that Fink does mention that I think is quite accurate is that, as you're going through and, looking at these articles for the purposes of including them into a literature review, one of the things to make particular note is that, it's going to be a bit time consuming, both in terms of gaining the familiarity that you need for each of these pieces of literature to be in a position so that you can synthesize and incorporate these things in an integrative way into a literature review where you're not discussing the literature, but you're discussing themes in the literature and using that literature as evidence for those themes. That's going to take a bit of time. Fink mentions here it could take upwards of an hour per article. I think during class I had mentioned that you're going to spend, about 25 or 30 minutes or more per article. So, keep in mind that it's going to be a bit time consuming, but the whole, the research process tends to be time consuming. In particular, that initial process, when you're still trying to figure out what does the literature say about my field and how can I find where the gaps in the literature are so that I can identify where it's worthwhile to conduct a research study. One of the things that she talks about in there is when you're using these sort of methodological screening modules, if you could have multiple people doing it, that would help, although there's also the issue of inter-rater reliability there. In your case, obviously, that's not a factor because you're doing these on your own. She does provide an example of a particular sort of screening questionnaire that you could use. So here's, one of the things that she talks about, are the main measures defined? Is there control in place? Is the sample size justified? But again, keeping in mind that these are very quantitative, objectivist kinds of questions that she has. So while I think the chapter is quite useful in terms of propelling you forward towards your literature review, there are aspects of it that I think are limiting because of her objectivist epistemology that she holds. The other thing that you want to do is, at the end of the day, the whole point of going through and doing this process is really to be able to essentially put this together in prose on the other side. So trying to find a way that you can classify, that you can organize your thoughts and organize your literature into sort of coherent things so that you're not going through and talking about how this particular study says this and this particular report from this ideological group says this and this thing that the Department of Education is promoting says this. You don't want to be in a position where that's all you're able to do, because that's not a review of the literature. That's a summary of the literature. A review of the literature is an integrative critique of the literature. So you want to be in a position where you can say, one of the main themes in the literature was X. And then, this particular piece of literature talks about X in these ways, and that's consistent with this other piece of literature that talks about X in similar kinds of ways. But, a few years later, which, happens to be more recently, this other group did a study that claimed that, X was, something completely different. And that is in line with what a lot of the folks that write about X in terms of a commentary, so folks that haven't done empirical research but have, made claims about X, have said. So you're not necessarily talking about a single piece of literature, you're talking about that theme, whatever that theme happens to be, and you're just using the literature as junks of wood on the fire, if you will, to provide sort of that evidence that it's there. But overall, chapter 4 I think is a useful one in moving you forward. But at the end of the day, as you're reading through chapter 4 of Fink, you basically want to keep in mind that I need to sort of develop my own model that I can put into place that will help me figure out how I can classify and understand the larger themes or topics that are being discussed in my literature, and then how I can organize my literature around those particular themes or topics.